Welcome to this session of History 2. Today we're talking about singers and songwriters of the 1970s and also country music of the 1970s. So this is a look at the impact of identity politics and authenticity as withdrawal into the self. So if part of authenticity in the 1960s was a losing of the sense of the self and a kind of a ecstatic moving out, right? Ecstasis means literally to stand out of yourself. That's part of the notion of the Dionysian, to lose that sense of the solidity of the borders of the ego in order to move out from yourself into the larger society, connect with others. Authenticity in the 70s becomes a kind of inverse of that, or a reversal of that, where the idea of authenticity is to become more self-involved in a sense, right? This is part of why it's called the me decade, this idea of turning inward, turning into the self. These things aren't unrelated. You can think of a kind of ebb and flow here, right? We all know, those of us who have dabbled, and I'm sure that's probably all of us at this point in our lives, with meditation, that part of the idea of meditation is that you're turning inward, you're going into yourself, but the part of that is in order to then be able to lead to a sort of higher consciousness, that the truth of otherness, the truth of the outside world is somehow locked within your internal your internal nature, right? Your intrinsic inner nature. But culturally, the 70s are a really interesting decade. They're a backlash in some ways, in many ways, to the 1960s. The overall political scene, especially with the advent of Nixon in the late 60s into the early 70s, is much more conservative, also much more suspicious, right? This is an era of a certain amount of political paranoia, and that's largely thanks to good old Nixon, right? The Watergate tapes, the White House tapes and the Watergate scandal, those led to a great politics of suspicion in general, that your best idea here, your best bet was to suspect that others were out to get you, and you had to be self-serving and look out for yourself. That's another aspect of it being a me decade, right? You got to look out for number one, and number one is always you. But that doesn't mean that there's not still this sense of authenticity. It's that authenticity here is more about you being yourself, not you being a part of a greater community in the sort of ideal of the hippies of the 60s, but you being whatever's true to yourself. Now, some of the hippie aspects of hippie culture will get integrated into that, as we'll see in a moment. All right, let's get started. Let's take a look. Oh, well, actually, one more thing to say before we move to the next slide is this idea of identity politics. This is the era, this is the decade where that comes to the fore. And identity politics are a very complicated affair, and we can spend a lot of time in our discussion sessions, if you wish, discussing the ramifications, the consequences, and the implications of identity politics. But just to get us started, it's this idea of identifying ourselves with categories, subcategories, right? So it's not just that I am an American or a U.S. citizen, but rather I'm an Italo-American or an Irish-American or an African-American and so on, right? That and that sense of subgroup identity is long-standing. Black American subgroup identity and immigrant American subgroup identity. But now it's becoming more and more the case for all people within the U.S., right? And then you have other forms of identity politics. It's not just about being, that's the interesting thing, first of all, about identity politics. On the one hand, you're saying that it's a politics, it's a way of making the personal political, of saying that this is who I am and that is a political stance, but that who you are in identity politics is always predicated upon some kind of social category, something that you are quite literally not. You're just saying that you are somehow subsumed in that category. So at the same time that you're talking about identity, it has two elements, right? On the one hand, your identity, what you are, is in contradistinction to everything else. But insofar as you identify with some category, that's an element of identity as well. And they seem to be somewhat contradictory, right? So you can see it's not a simple matter here of identity or of authenticity as withdrawal, that it involves a series of contradictions that can be productive contradictions or they can be problematic contradictions, depending on who's doing the thinking through them and who's acting through them. And so these relatively micro causes. I mean, micro it sounds diminishing, but I mean more local causes or concerns, or rather fractures of the larger political landscape become emblematized at this time. So, for instance, this is the great decade of concern with the environment, of environmentalism, and that becomes a kind of identity politics. And the use of the hyphenated American names, right? The suspicion of assimilation, which has already begun by the mid '60s. It reaches a kind of, again, paranoid height in the '70s. The '70s, if you think of each decade, obviously decades in the cultural sense don't have to begin right at the turn of the decade, right? If you think of decades in the cultural sense, then really this one begins more or less with 69, 70, right? With Altamont. And then I would say goes until 78 or so. The 80s in some ways begins around 78. We'll talk about why I think that at a later date. So, in one sense, you're dealing with a period roughly from, let's say, 70 to 78. That is a period of a great deal of paranoia. And that's the style of that decade, is a paranoia, suspicion. A kind of ironic distance gets developed. And irony is a major element of literature and music of this time as well. The sense of not wanting to be, in a way, too attached to commitment. That commitment itself is suspect, right? The people that seemed so committed in the 60s, well, what were they getting out of it? What was their angle, right? So the 70s is about looking for angles. And then we'll see that looking for angles gets celebrated in a weird way in the 80s. But during the 70s, there's still enough of a carryover from the 60s that this is looked askance at a bit, that we should be committed, and yet we can't be committed. Yet there's this suspicion of commitment. All right, let's look at some slides. So the counterculture becomes the main style, right? The hippie movement is really dying out as far as it being a communal element, but certain aspects of it, the slang, the mode of dress, that gets absorbed into the 70s style, the bell-bottom pants and so on, right? And yet there's an element here that is new. The woman's outfit here is not something that you would have seen as much in the 60s, the hot pants, the leather hot pants at that, right? But the leather jacket, the boots, this is a picture from 71 that I wanted to make sure I got the exact right date. So you can see elements, the long hair that's carried over from the hippies, but now it's stylized with the mutton chops, as you can see on the guy all the way to the right. There are some distinctive differences, and yet certain carryovers from the hippie aesthetic. But these are things that are mass-produced clothing. This isn't just thrift store clothing or whatever else that the hippies might have worn. It's meant to look a bit like that and yet not be that, right? So this is an era where consumption matters in a different way than it did in the 60s, although not to the extreme that it will in the 90s. Published in 1970 and almost an immediate smash hit, this book, John Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach, becomes emblematic really of the period. It's an illustrative fable, so it's basically a picture book for adults. An illustrative fable concerning a seagull that refuses to conform and is cast out of the flock, but pursues self-reflection. So you can see it's sort of I mean, I don't know how dumbed down it is. It's a little dumbed down, I suppose. It's a pretty, it's kind of a mass-produced and mass-based spiritual journey. And that's very typical of the 70s. There are a lot of these books that are meant to, from the 70s and onward, and even the late 60s, that are meant to have mass appeal, to be on the New York bestsellers list, and yet be about a sort of spiritual journey, about something that the everyman can do, and yet taps into our higher form of being. Another book published in 1970 is this one, The Primal Scream by Arthur Janov. He was this, as you can see here, he calls it primal therapy, the cure for neurosis. And just like Freud, what he believed was that neurosis and most of our psychological problems developed because of repression, because we would repress the various traumas that we've experienced, right? Not suppression. Suppression can be a good thing, right? Like right now, I want to get through this lecture and I want to get this done, so I feel like it's done. So I'm suppressing my desire for a candy bar. But repression's something else. Repression is suppressing to the point of forgetting, of hating the thing that is repressed. I don't hate the fact that I want a candy bar. I just want one, and I'll get one later. Trust, I'll get one later. Right? But repression would be hating myself for it, that I hate that I want it, that I hate that it has some hold of desire on me, right? And repression, when you're dealing with more important things like how we feel about family members, how we feel about love, how we feel about our own sexuality, how we feel about how we were brought up, that can lead to various forms of repression where we hate ourselves, and so we repress that side of ourselves. We kill it off. Right? Now, Janov's solution to that is the scream, that what you do is you are engaged in these moments of rather violent rejection of the things that we repressed. So we scream it out. We scream out the thing that we're repressing or that we feel is somehow oppressing us, right? So in some of these sessions, people would throw furniture, break furniture, throw things at each other. They were slugging each other, right? It's not things that we would think of as being particularly healthy, but his idea was that you had to get this out. Right? You can see how this is kind of, in some ways, a continuation of some of what we were talking about with the 60s, that the 60s were about this idea of the Dionysian and the chaos with Dionysus, right? But their version of that was this immersion in emotion and fellow feeling and connecting to other people. And what Janov's doing is, I think, very characteristic of the 70s. He's taking that and saying, no, you want to talk about chaos, then let's face up to the chaos. Let's deal with the chaos, right? And that chaos is negative, and it's going to be expressed as negation, right? When you scream at something, you're negating it. If I scream at you, stop, I'm not asking you to stop. I'm not guiding you towards something. I'm negating you. I'm saying stop what you're doing. Stop it so that it no longer exists, so that there's no positive existence of it. It is negated. It is done, right? Screaming is always rejection. And so notice that, right? He's in essence, what he's doing is he's trying to get you to reject the rejection you've experienced. And he's seeing that as somehow empowering. And people describe it as a kind of emptying out of all the anger, all the angst, all the concern and the things that are troubling you, the anxieties. But at the same time, there's a school of thought, and that is also Freudian, that answering violence with violence, answering repression with another form of repression, answering negation with another form of negation doesn't cure anything. It doesn't help anything, right? That the idea is to channel it, not to just sort of luxuriate in it. But there were plenty of people that believed in this very strongly. One of them was John Lennon, to bring this back to music. In his early solo records of the 1970s, you can hear him, for instance, in the song Mother, right? Where he's literally screaming, a primal scream. He wrecked his voice doing it for a while. I mean, he recovered, but it was just screaming Mother in this ragged out way that's ragging his voice. And here's the man of the era of the switch to the era. He's in office from 69 to 74. We have a lot of negative things. Speaking of the negative, to thank him for here, right? He really created and wrote out the conservative backlash to the 60s. He believed that what he was doing was speaking for the silent majority, and I think that's interesting too, right? By saying that there is a silent majority, you're saying that the great number of people don't believe in the things the hippies believed in, which we could take as in his sense, as being a loss of social mores, a loss of values as the new conservative revolution that he helped to bring into place and that Reagan in some ways perfected. has to do with this idea of centering the Republican Party around values, right? And what they mean is conservative values, values that stay the same. Because after all, if there are human values, why should they change? If we are humans, and shouldn't values stay the same? Well, that's one way of looking at being a human. Another way is to think that humans are inherently about adaptability, about changing, and that our values change as we change and as the world changes because of our ways of acting upon that world and our reactions to each other and our learning more, right? So you can believe in value without believing that they have to be inherently conservative, that the idea is always preserving a tradition. In fact, that very notion, right? A tradition is sometimes thought of, at least by some people, as being dead once all you're doing is preserving it. Once all you're doing is archiving it and not changing it. A living tradition develops, it adapts, just like living beings do. It continues to live on. But Nixon is doing something different. And here's the thing that's interesting about Nixon. He's not a small government guy, the way that Reagan at least purports to be. And we'll talk later about whether or not Reagan actually lived up to that ideal. Nixon's not. Nixon believed in the state. He really did believe that there had to be social programs, that the government had an obligation to do things on behalf of the people and so on. But his vision of that was a very much a top-down one, where that meant that the government had to exert a great deal of control. And so he's maintaining the war in Vietnam, and he also inaugurates the war on drugs, right? That goes back to him. This idea of creating social control through legal means and through punishment of what we might think of as social problems, right? That drug use might be recreational. It might be perfectly healthy if kept in moderation. I think it depends on a lot of things there. It depends on one's personality, one's frequency of use, the kinds of things that one's using. But for Nixon, anything that is illicit, so anything that's non-alcohol related or tobacco related, is automatically the source of abuse. And we might think of addiction as being a social and psychological problem, but for him it becomes a legal problem based in punishment, right? And he creates that paranoid style that I've been talking about, where he thinks that that what we're doing in world politics is playing a zero-sum game. So he has to defeat communism. And by the way, he didn't invent this way of looking at things. He got this as much from Kennedy as anyone else, who also believed this about foreign affairs, about global politics. That it's a zero-sum game. Insofar as I'm winning, other people have to lose. And so there really is a contest between communism and capitalism. And notice that those things aren't actually addressing the same thing, even if they seem to. One is a monetary thing, whereas communism isn't automatically a monetary thing. It's a form of social organization, right? But that confusion is something that has developed out of the 50s and is really profitably exploited by this conservative revolution that Nixon is a big part of. Then you have the rise of the special interest groups, right? This idea of people creating a kind of identity politics, that they identify with a certain way of looking at the world, and they want to foster that. This is the rise in government of lobbying. It's not that lobbying didn't occur before. Of course it did. But the 70s is a great period of expansion. And if we want to think of the government as becoming increasingly corrupt, a good decade to study would be the 70s, where lobbyists have increasing control in Washington, and special interest groups of all sorts have increasing control. And there's a usefulness in that for the government. Because if I can get a semi-powerful interest group to be satisfied, then they're gonna have vested interest. They're not gonna want the other special interest groups to get the same kind of attention, and so they're gonna help the government keep those other groups in some kind of check, right? This is a way of fracturing the political landscape that the 60s, at least ideally, was trying not to. Now, not all fracturing is bad. There might be some usefulness out of this fracturing, but the point that I'm trying to suggest here is that there's a pretty different political style Some carry over, but some different, very different emphases from the 60s to the 70s. Here's one of those, the primary special interest groups or identity groups of this period, identity politics, which is second wave feminism. First wave feminism was concerned really with material benefits and legal allowances or rights and privileges, right? So for instance, voting, simple things like that, right? Voting rights were a huge part of first wave feminism. There were concrete goals, and it had to do with what you were allowed to do. Second wave feminism has much more to do with perceptions and how people think of women as far as gender roles are concerned. So this is the decade, the 70s. It really starts in the 60s, as we already saw with Betty Friedan, and this idea of the feminine mystique, the idea that women will be more fulfilled by having jobs outside of the home, not just being housewives and mothers. Now, on the one hand, that's still a first wave issue because it does have to do with equal representation in the workplace, equal access to what are seen as the material goods of a capitalist society. But on the other hand, it has to do with the image. I mean, after all, it is called the feminine mystique, right? It has to do with the image of womanhood and how the woman is seen, and that she loses certain material benefits by the way she's seen. Well, with this next generation, like Gloria Steinem and the great second wave feminists of the 1970s, there's a shift to another set of concerns, which really has to do with how one is seen, not just the opportunities that are afforded to them, but how one is seen and treated. So this is the decade, and Gloria Steinem founds the magazine called Ms., right? So instead of being a Miss or a Mrs., where your identity is partially determined by whether or not you are married, you can be a Ms., where it's indeterminate. Ms. doesn't mean you're married. It doesn't mean you're not married, right? It's indeterminate in that way, in the same way that Mr. is. If I'm Mr. Jenkins, you don't know whether I'm married or not. And therefore, if I'm Ms. Jenkins, you don't know whether I'm married or not, right? This is the period where some women begin to object to doors being held open for them as a form of chivalry, which somehow puts the woman in the weaker role, and therefore, culturally speaking, symbolically speaking, and therefore is questionable. This is the period where bras are thought of as a form of oppression, or makeup, as you can see in this photo. Can makeup cover, what does this say? The wounds of our oppression, right? Can makeup cover the wounds of our oppression? That makeup is a way of kind of hiding the suffering of women, that making them into something ornamental for men to enjoy instead of having lives of their own. Again, we're talking about this notion of the inner life, right? This withdrawal into the self. That's such an important part of the 1970s. And then notice the other woman's banner there. Women are people, not livestock. So they're not just meant to be milked and to produce children and to be herded into homes, but they have a life, or ought to have lives, that are every bit as socially invigorated and invigorating as men have. And so this is a period where literature begins to be examined critically for the representations of women, where it becomes more about how they're perceived and how we can control that notion of perception than about concrete material goals. This is, of course, the decade with the rise in mainstream interest, but also obviously local in the sense of the interest of the community in gay rights. Right, throughout most of the history of the U.S., gays lived in a subculture. They avoided being outed. Sometimes they would hide their identity entirely. Sometimes not so much. The smaller enclaves of people would sometimes be openly gay, but they were marginalized communities, often subjected to a great deal of harassment. And so there's the gay bar Stonewall in 1969. It was a haven for fairly open gay expression, but it was also an area that dealt with a great deal of harassment from the police. And in 1969, for various reasons, the tension bubbled over and there were the riots. This really led to an era both of pursuit of gay rights, but also this idea of what it meant to be an out person with respect to identity, and then also the idea of a kind of identity formation within the larger community, and that we see in the next slide with the early versions of the Gay Pride Parade, right? The idea that Stonewall means that one should fight back, smash gay oppression, and then notice it's the Gay Caucus against war and fascism, right? This is seen social oppression or social ignorance or social denial of gayness as a form of fascism, right? And perhaps even a form of war. Of course, they also mean actual war. At the time of this particular march, the Vietnam War is still very much in play, and you can see some of them are veterans of the Vietnam War. So this idea that what is deeply personal, one's sexuality, one's gendered role within one's family and relationships, these things that were generally thought of as part of the private sphere are emerging more and more into the open light of the public sphere. And this is the great era of considering the personal political. There is nothing that is personal is outside of the political realm, but your personal identification, your way of manifesting who you are, that is a social and political statement. And so some of that, in a way, what's happening here is a kind of negotiation of two sides of a Rousseauian coin, right? Jean-Jacques Rousseau talks about this idea of the self as being aside from society, outside of society. It's something that society can't quite reconcile with. And part of the 70s seems to believe that, but at the same time, that self is expressed through various social categories. And we'll see this over and over again with the punk styles, obviously with various gay styles that are emerging, the absorption of the counterculture within mainstream culture that we've already discussed in this particular session, that this negotiation of that space between the public and the private, the inner and the outer, is a big part of what's going on. The singer-songwriters participate strongly in that dialectic, right? They developed out of the folk music tradition of the 60s, but the lyrics are largely explorations of the self. So we're not talking about protest songs. There's a confessional style here, telling your inner secrets, your inner feelings, right? Things that are so deeply personally yours, and yet at the same time, the expectation is that the audience will identify with it. Not because they've had the same experience, because after all, what you're doing is you're positing this as a deeply personal experience, something that's yours and yours alone. But because we all have things that are mine and mine alone, and you have some things that are yours and yours alone, then we can relate to that, right? We're all unique, just like everyone else. That sort of paradox. So they're not political, with some exceptions. They're confessional, to the point that, some of the songs, like You're So Vain by Carly Simon, she doesn't reveal who she's talking about, and that becomes a big part of it, right? Figuring out who she's talking about, and this idea of getting a glimpse into the thoughts and the personal feelings of these singers. And the relationship between fiction and autobiography becomes blurred. A lot of these songs are about their personal experiences, and yet obviously when you make something into a poem or a story, you can't help but fictionalize to some extent. You're giving it a sense of form. You can never tell things exactly as they were, because nothing is exactly as it was. Right? It's always a matter of how we look at it, how we understand it. So this deeper and deeper concern with the self, that's part of the me decade. Most of the music deals with romantic difficulties, feelings of isolation or depression, sexual freedom and desire, the family drama and trauma, the emotional problems of growing older. Those are all themes within singer-songwriter output. One of the early examples of this is, of course, James Taylor's Sweet Baby James from 1970. He put out the album James Taylor in 68, and then released the single Fire and Rain, which became a pop number 2 in 70, and then the album Sweet Baby James, which was a pop 3 on the album charts in 1970. He moved to New York to start a band called The Flying Machine, By the summer of 1966, they were performing at the Night Owl Cafe in Greenwich Village alongside groups like the Turtles, and the band did well gigging, but their recordings went nowhere, and Taylor was addicted to heroin. In 1967, he goes to Britain as a solo act, and he meets Peter Asher, the head of A&R for Apple Records, and he plays demos for the Beatles, and they love it, right? So he records his first album under the aegis of Apple Records. It's critically acclaimed, but it sold pretty poorly, in part because Taylor was in rehab. He wasn't able to tour to support the album. He returns to the U.S. and releases Sweet Baby James, and this is his breakout hit. The album features Fire and Rain, a classic example of the 70s confessional/autobiographical style. The song refers rather obliquely to a friend's suicide, right? Also, Taylor struggles with addiction, but also his attempts to revive his career and establish a career, and it's all delivered in this kind of quasi-mysterious or elusive manner that winds up having many fans construct theories about the song's meaning, right? You can still see people debating about what this line or that line means. Some of them are fairly clear, and some of them are very obscure, and that mixture of the evident and the enigmatic becomes a huge part of the singer-songwriter style in general. Time magazine called Taylor, quote, the face of new rock. It's interesting to think of James Taylor as a rock musician, right? We tend to think of the singer-songwriters as more closely aligned to some mixture of folk music and Tin Pan Alley music, but he's called the new face of rock, and compared him to Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights, and this is an illustration from one version of Wuthering Heights, the famous novel by Emily Bronte. They also compare him to the title character of The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is the story by Goethe, German epistolary novel, meaning that it's a novel composed of a bunch of letters about this guy, Werther, who's this kind of romantic poet and very tied to his emotions, and he falls in love with this woman who doesn't return his desires, and so he commits suicide, and people were so affected by this novel back in the day that Goethe wound up having to put in the preface, be a man and don't do these things, because there was a spate of suicides with people who were being dredged out of the river with copies of this book in their pocket, right? So this kind of extreme emotionality. Time magazine writes, Taylor's use of elemental imagery, darkness and sunlight, references to roads traveled and untraveled, to fears spoken and left unsaid, reaches a level of both intimacy and controlled emotion rarely achieved in purely pop music. You've Got a Friend, 1971, was written by Carole King with backing vocals by Joni Mitchell, and that was his first number one hit. That was a big number for him. And then, of course, Carole King does her own version of it on the album we're going to talk about next. And that's this album, Tapestry, a pop number one in 1970, which is really a reinvention of Carole King. Remember, she was one of the premier brill-building composers of the 1960s, working with her then husband, Jerry Goffin, and she wrote or co-wrote 118 hits at that time. Then she becomes a singer-songwriter in the 1970s. So she goes from being a behind-the-scenes writer-producer to being a very much on-the-scene performer. Tapestry was number one for 15 weeks and remained on the album charts for over 6 years. It has the second longest stay on the album charts after, of course, the reigning king of long-staying presence on the charts, which is Dark Side of the Moon. The album Tapestry won 4 Grammy Awards. The album featured new songs and new renditions of some of her early work. So It's Too Late was a hit single and number one on the pop and easy listening charts. And now there is a such thing as the easy listening charts from the end of the 60s. We talked about the rise of Muzak and the importance of elevator music not long ago. And now you can see that it's being charted by Billboard. The album cover itself is iconic. Remember, we said that from the late 60s, album covers are taking on increasing importance as part of the artwork of the album. And here she's clearly positioning herself. We've been talking about identity politics and gender roles. And here she's very clearly positioning herself as someone who, on the one sense, is independent and self-reliant. She has a sort of hippie vibe or a kind of laid-back vibe with the bare feet, right? She's in a domestic space, though, not the public sphere, but the private sphere. She's holding a tapestry that she's clearly stitching, so she's doing traditional hobbies or women's work, if you wish. But at the same time, the way that she's staring at the camera, the pose, the fact that she's dominating that frame gives her a centrality, it gives her a sense of purpose, it gives her a sense of being the role of the artist genius here. And then, of course, she's got the cat sitting there in the foreground, which again kind of deflates some of that, right? And it creates this nice, I think, asymmetry that you can see moving from her leg that's down to the leg that's propped up to the cat, and that creates this kind of flow toward the right of the space, just as the lighting does, where we're moving from the dark to the light. So there's a lot of things we can read into this kind of album cover, right? That there's a stance of self-reliance while still playing on the traditional roles of women. And that welcoming role, that setting you at ease role, while at the same time, it doesn't show her in any kind of subservient role. She's very much of her own metal here. She's very self-assured. Paul Simon, the big album for us here would be his Still Crazy After All These Years from 75. That was a pop #1. After the split with Art Garfunkel, he began experimenting with world music. An early example is Mother and Child Reunion, which uses Jamaican elements on his album, self-titled album from 1972. But Still Crazy is probably his most important album. It's much darker in tone following his divorce, so again, very personal revelations. It includes the #1 hit single, his only #1, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. The song Still Crazy After All These Years demonstrates Simon's interest in more complex arrangements. The verse and chorus include jazz harmonies, but the bridge veers off in a different harmonic direction altogether, leading to a surprisingly placed modulation in the midst of the return to the verse. Usually, if you're going to have a modulation, you have it between iterations of a chorus, or maybe right after a bridge or guitar solo into the ending chorus. Or there are a couple different schemes that are typical. He chooses to take the last verse and modulate within the midst of it, and that's actually much more difficult to do as a writer. It's more difficult to do as a performer, and it's more difficult to take in as a listener. It can easily seem jarring. Listen carefully to that moment and see what you think. Right? To me, this is one of his great tracks. The extended saxophone solo is not my favorite bit. I think there are some issues there that, again, we can disagree with each other on that. But the modulation in the verse is one of his brilliant moments, I think, as a composer. Barry Manilow is perhaps the most successful of the American singer-songwriters. In 1978, he had 5 albums simultaneously on the bestseller charts. Between 74 and 83, he had 46 top 40 hits, 13 #1s. He started in musical theater with a 1964 off-Broadway musical called The Drunkard, and then he worked as a jingle writer. So again, we have this interesting link between the truly commercial side of things, music that's not even pretending to be art, jingles, and then music that is mass art, the stuff that we're mostly talking about. In the early 1970s, he's trying to break through as a songwriter, and he's working with Bette Midler's accompanist at her shows at the Continental Baths in New York City. He worked as her musical director for 2 albums and a tour through 1975. In 1969, Columbia Pictures Industry buys a small label, Bell Records, who then later has Manilow on it, right? Clive Davis is put in charge and seeks to revitalize Columbia Pictures' music division. By 1974, he forms Arista Records. Barry Manilow, too, his second album, breaks through on Arista Records with the single Mandy, which was a pop hit, #1 in 1975, and then many other hits follow. Critics continually attack his music. I mean, to this day, Barry Manilow's name is sometimes used as an insult for sort of cheesy, overly sentimental, too obvious of music, that it doesn't have the emotional depth of a lot of the other singer-songwriters, but is sort of glitzier on the surface. Take songs like the Copacabana, right, that are almost Las Vegas in their orientation. There are, of course, too many singer-songwriters to talk about in any depth. You have singers like Carly Simon. We've mentioned You're So Vain. That was a pop one in 72. Harry Chapin with the very famous Cats in the Cradle. You hear that song all the time. It's a cultural icon and a kind of meme. A long-standing one from 1974, pop number one. Don McLean's American Pie, that very, very long song that sometimes gets chided because of its length, pop number one in 72. And then Jim Croce's Time in a Bottle, pop number one in 74. Really great singer-songwriter song release. Then you have the singer-songwriters that are in the contexts of rock bands, like Bruce Springsteen, of course, and Jackson Browne. We will talk about Bruce Springsteen in the 80s when we're talking about Born in the USA. And then there are other singers-songwriters that might fit this mold, like Tom Petty, and we're also going to catch up with him in the 1980s. Joni Mitchell is a Canadian singer-songwriter, so now we're going to talk about some singer-songwriters from outside of the U.S. She's among the most important and influential female recording artists, really, of the 20th century. She's an innovator in songwriting and guitar technique. We often forget to look at the more subtle forms of guitar technique when we're looking at the open virtuosity of someone like Jimi Hendrix, but Joni Mitchell's guitar technique is just as interesting in revealing especially her use of odd tunings and unexpected harmonic complexes, partly because of the odd tunings. What she herself says she does is she tries to develop these tunings that she finds interesting that allow her to sort of put her hands on interesting sounding chords that she wouldn't come up with if she knew what she was doing right away. Then, of course, she figures out what she's doing and translates that to a full song. But just that there's something I find interesting about that, the sense of wonder that she's bringing, almost a forced wonder that she brings to her songwriting, where she's discovering something and then building on that discovery. She moves to the U.S. in 1965, and she begins getting other artists to perform her songs. Chelsea Morning and Both Sides Now, those were both hits for Judy Collins, the folk singer. And this led to her getting a record contract, to Joni Mitchell getting a record contract. In the in the 1970s, she emerges as a performer in her own right with a chain of hits and notable songs, including Big Yellow Taxi, a major song for her, and Woodstock, both from 1970. And Woodstock, of course, was kind of an anthem for Woodstock. Her album Blue of 1971 is one of her most important, and really one of the most important albums, period, of the singer-songwriter genre. Again, we have the iconic album cover here, a close-up of her face, singing into a microphone, looking perhaps a little mournful, a little sad. The blue lighting and the lighting in general, the blue tint and then the lighting brings out a kind of hollowness in her face, an almost skull-like character. This is a record cover that connotes or denotes a kind of deathly presence, a haunting sadness, right? The lyrics are mostly about failed relationships and therefore deeply, deeply personal. She at times even basically names names, so you know that she's talking about specific situations that you can draw on. Blue, songs are like tattoos. This is from the song Blue. Blue, songs are like tattoos. You know I've been to sea before. Crown and anchor me or let me sail away. It's an interesting use of imagery, right? On the one hand, blue with all of its connotations, but also the blue of the sea. Songs are like tattoos. Again, tying it to nautical themes. Sailors and pirates often have tattoos, and songs are like tattoos in that they leave an indelible mark on your skin if they're meaningful, if they mean something to you. You don't get rid of them so easily. You know, I've been to sea before. It's not her first relationship. So she's keeping with that nautical theme, but letting us know that this isn't her first time in a relationship. And then she says, crown and anchor me, which might mean marriage. It might mean just some kind of commitment, right? Or let me sail away. So this extended use of the nautical metaphors in order to get across something that probably most of us have experienced in some fashion. Mitchell went on to produce several more intriguing albums, many of them in the genre of jazz fusion, and that would be something interesting for some of you to talk about perhaps for part of your midterm, but not something we're going to explore here. Elton John is another of the extremely successful singer-songwriters from England in this case. He's perhaps the most successful of the non-Americans, with albums like Honky Chateau in 72 with the song Rocket Man, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player of 73 with Crocodile Rock, which was a #1 hit, and then Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, perhaps his finest album, with songs like Candle in the Wind, Benny and the Jets, etc., including one of my favorite songs, which is the title track of Yellow Brick Road. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. He then releases Caribou in 74. These are all #1 albums in both the US and the UK, except for Chateau, which only got to #2 on the UK, but was still #1 in the US. Most of his songs are collaborations with the lyricist Bernie Taupin. They began to work together in 67, mostly writing songs for other artists at DJM Records. In 1968, John begins recording his own work, and he had a hit with Your Song, which was #7 UK in 1970. With Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, he began to dress in bizarre costumes, connecting him to glam and theater rock genres that were then emerging, and we can see that in the next slide, with these sort of exaggerated glasses that he's wearing, and the leather but kind of strange suit-like costume, and then the feathers off the sides as epaulettes in a fashion. There are several other non-U.S. singer-songwriters that are of note. For instance, Van Morrison with Moondance, a Pop 29 album in 1970, and then Cat Stevens, Tea for the Tillerman in 1970, and the song Wild World. Several of his songs, Cat Stevens, appear on the soundtrack for a cult classic film of the 1970s called Harold and Maude by Hal Ashby. If you haven't seen that film, I think it's a great representation of cinematic art in the 1970s. The 1970s, of course, a great era for films. Anyway, we've already talked a little bit about some films like Shaft, and or maybe we haven't talked about that yet. I guess that's coming. But we will talk about Shaft and black exploitation films or blaxploitation films. And then, of course, this was the era of The Godfather and other just great cinematic masterworks. Then we have the other side of the singer-songwriters, the more experimental side of things, with people like Randy Newman. Randy Newman, most of the 60s, he's working as a songwriter, producing hits for other people. In 1968, he releases the album Randy Newman, featuring I Think It's Going to Rain Today, an amazing song. His albums this album at least doesn't chart, but that song becomes the standard that many performers sing. Nina Simone does a version, Art Garfunkel, Wilson Pickett, Harry Nilsson will do a version. In fact, he performs an entire album of Newman songs with Newman on the piano, and that's a pretty successful album for Harry Nilsson, who of course is one of the great, he's sort of an adjunct to the singer-songwriters. He's one of the great singers. He doesn't really write too many songs, but one of the great performers of that era. Then he releases a bunch of, I think, amazing albums with relatively little commercial success, but he gets a decent amount of critical acclaim, and he's part of the cultural zeitgeist, if you will, in the 1970s. There's Sail Away, which is maybe his finest album in some ways, in 1972. The Good Old Boys, 1974. Little Criminals in 77. His songs are harmonically experimental. There's a lot of unresolved dissonance. There's references to older styles like ragtime, some surprising harmonic shifts, some chord progressions that you just don't see coming, that aren't the typical ones at all. And then his lyrics are politically satirical. There are songs about U.S. aggression throughout the world, like sometimes from the point of view of the aggressor, like why don't we just bomb the hell out of the rest of the country, right? The French want to criticize us, so we'll bomb them and then make the country into an extended Disney World, like that kind of stuff in his songs. He has other songs about child murder, silly prejudices, like his song Short People, which a lot of people wound up taking seriously. That's the problem with irony. You never know when someone's going to take you seriously. So he has a song, Short People, what is it? Short people have no reason to live, right? Is the refrain line. He means that obviously satirically, but a lot of people didn't take it that way. That they took it as prejudice against little people. and there were news items about it and so on. One of the songs on Sail Away, the song Sail Away, is about the slave trade, where this guy is basically trying to convince people to get in the slave ship, and they're going to lead a better life in America, because America's the home of promise, right? And they'll get away from this primitive existence, of course, to be enslaved. So that we know that there's irony there, that there's a hook in the bait. And then Southern racism in general, that's another topic that shows up in a lot of his songs. We also have Tom Waits' Small Change of 1976 is the album that I'm highlighting here. Again, the cover does a lot of work, right? Closing Time is his first album, 1973. It's a fairly straightforward piano-based singer-songwriter album on Asylum Records, but then he has a string of albums influenced by jazz and beat poetry. The Heart of Saturday Night, these are all favorite albums, in my opinion. These are all amazing albums. Heart of Saturday Night, 1974, Small Change, 1976, and so on. But then in the 80s, and we're not in the 80s yet, but I'm not going to come back for Tom Waits, so we'll talk about it now. He releases a string of these really highly experimental albums with very odd chord progressions and odd harmonic schemes and song forms and lyrics, and a lot of distortion on the voice, a lot of atonal moments in the music. So there's Swordfish Trombones in 83, Rain Dogs in 85, Frank's Wild Years in 87, bizarre instrumentation, strange lyrical conceptions, and then increasingly odd and barking vocal delivery tempered with a kind of rough-hewn sweetness, right? So check some of that out when you get a chance. Let's talk a bit about country in the 1970s to wrap things up. And one of the main subgenres of country of this time is the outlaw country style. This is a reaction to the slick production style of Nashville. It's sort of furthering things that we already saw with the Bakersfield sound. It shows the influence of rock, particularly Southern rock, and we'll talk more about Southern rock soon, much more than even the Bakersfield sound did, although some figures, like Merle Haggard from Bakersfield, are also considered progenitors of outlaw country. This form of country music was more associated with the counterculture than earlier approaches, including the Bakersfield sound, which, as you remember, Merle Haggard was somewhat critical of the counterculture, at least openly critical of the counterculture. The term seems to have been first used in reference to country music with the Lee Clayton song Ladies Love Outlaws, sung by Waylon Jennings on his album of the same name, Ladies Love Outlaws. It soon began appearing in journalism and was used for a compilation album in 1976 called, which you see pictured here, Wanted, The Outlaws, featuring Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, whom you see there as well, Jesse Coulter, and Temple Glazier. So those four artists. This was country music's first platinum certified album. That means it sold over 1 million copies. And country music, for the most part, in the history of country music has not been an album-oriented genre as much as rock becomes in the middle of the 60s, and soul becomes in the soul starts to become more of an album-oriented thing, at least some of it, with Ray Charles's Modern Sounds in Country Music. And now country music is starting to become more album-oriented than it had been before, but a decade later than those others. One of the most important songwriters of this era is Steve Young with Lonesome, Ornery, and Mean, and then Billy Joe Shaver, one of the most celebrated songwriters of the outlaw country style. He has an album that he put out in 1973 called Old Five and Dimers Like Me, and it's a classic album. It didn't sell super well, but many of the songs on that album have become country standards, and many other performers have recorded them, including, as we'll see, Waylon Jennings, who did a whole album of nothing but Billy Joe Shaver, or almost nothing but Billy Joe Shaver songs. Willie Nelson, of course, perhaps the most celebrated of the outlaw country artists, especially the album Red-Headed Stranger of 1975, which we'll talk about in a moment. Willie Nelson spent the 60s working in Nashville as a songwriter and bass player. If you remember, I mentioned he wrote the song Crazy, which was made famous by Patsy Cline, although he had his own version of it. And he wrote the song Hello Walls, which was made famous by Farron Young, although, again, Willie Nelson had his own version of it. But his versions weren't the successes. It was the ones done by other artists. Both of these are classics of the Nashville sound, so they were taken and used by producers like Chet Atkins to build this big, slick sound that was so characteristic of Nashville in the late 50s and then 60s. He was frustrated, though, that he didn't have more success as a performer on RCA Victor, so he retired. He moved to Austin, Texas in 1972, and he thought he was out of the game. But he kept hearing people in Austin. He started to be interested in some of the younger country artists, and so he comes out of retirement, only a year later, and signs with Atlantic Records. He was their first country artist. Atlantic didn't do country prior to this. And he turned toward outlaw country and became one of its top artists, along with Waylon Jennings. In 1974, he releases Phases and Stages, a concept album about divorce, and produced and starred in the pilot episode of the PBS show Austin City Limits. So he's connecting with the larger culture through TV, and also he's connecting with the whole singer-songwriter thing with these confessional lyrics. 1975, he switches to Columbia Records and releases Red-Headed Stranger, which is another concept album, this time telling a kind of story. It concerns a fugitive on the run after killing his wife and her lover. Columbia thought the arrangements were too bare. They actually thought it was a demo. When he brought it, they said, "Oh, that sounds like it's going in the right direction. I'll be curious to hear what the finished album's like." And he goes, No. This is the finished album. This is done." And they weren't sure they wanted to release it. They thought the concept was too dark. They thought that the sound was too unrefined, too unfinished. But many people, including me, consider this perhaps his finest album, his best album, and it really solidified his reputation as a artist. Waylon Jennings, of course, Honky Tonk Heroes, 1973. He started as a rockabilly artist, even played bass with Buddy Holly. He had a band called the Wailers, obviously after his own name. Moved toward a more standard country sound, but with a strong rock feel. So he's part of that Bakersfield, or drawing on that Bakersfield sound. He signed to RCA Victor and insisted that he be allowed to produce his own albums in a somewhat less polished sound. So he wanted to be more like the Bakersfield sound rather than the Nashville sound. He had a string of successful albums, including Lonesome, Ornery, and Mean, which we talked about a moment ago. Honky Tonk Heroes in 1973 with all the songs by Billy Joe Shaver. Dream in My Dreams in 74, and Are You Ready for the Country from 76. All considered classic releases. I think one of the great songwriters of this period within this style was Kris Kristofferson. He first found success, again, as a songwriter for other artists, just like we saw with Willie Nelson. He gave a tape of his songs to June Carter to hand to Johnny Cash, but the latter didn't listen to them. He waited a while, and then the famous story goes that he got Cash's attention by landing a helicopter in Cash's front yard, and Cash was surprised by the gesture, impressed by it, and so he listened to it, and Cash had a hit with Sunday Morning Coming Down, and several other artists start gaining traction with Kristofferson's song. Now, I know it's blasphemy to say this, but I think that Kristofferson's version of Sunday Morning Coming Down is even better than Johnny Cash's, and he starts to release versions of his own songs. In 1970, on Monument Records, he releases his first solo album, Kristofferson, which includes his versions of the songs that were already familiar, including Sunday Morning Coming Down, and a few new songs. It wasn't a hit on its initial release, but it's then re-released after Janis Joplin has a hit with Me and Bobby McGee. He re-releases the album as Me and Bobby McGee. It's the same album, just a new title, but now it's a hit. It sells much better, partly because of the strength of other people doing his songs. Let's talk about some female artists in the 1970s, country artists. Female artists in country in the late 60s and 70s rose to greater prominence than before, loosely following the model of Patsy Cline, combining a kind of sweet vulnerability with a brassy and direct delivery. Several women gained acclaim during this decade, including Tammy Wynette, Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris. Let's take a closer look at three of them. Loretta Lynn, Coal Miner's Daughter of 1970s, of course, her breakthrough album. She's already a featured member of the country scene in the 60s. Lynn was one of the ruling figures, though, of the late 60s, early 70s country style, with songs like Don't Come Home A-Drinkin' with Lovin' on Your Mind, right? The sort of pay on to men who come home drunk and then expect to have marital relations, and she's saying that that's not showing her respect, right? So that was the number one country in 1967. And then, of course, her real breakthrough, Coal Miner's Daughter, a very personal autobiographical song, number one country in 1970. Her songs focused on growing up in poverty and blue-collar working class issues of infidelity and marital hardship. She also sang songs that challenged conservative values. The Pill, for instance, in 1975. One's On the Way, about having many kids, right, even in poverty. And then Rated X in 1972, which was about divorce and the double standards between men and women, which is a fairly daring song for this period. We saw another daring song with divorce in Tammy Wynette, the same singer who did Stand By Your Man. So Rated X, though, is about divorce, double standards, being widowed by the Vietnam War in another song called Dear Uncle Sam. So some pretty bold political statements in some of these songs. Again, I think indicative of the 70s, because all of these political statements are coming from a place of personal suffering, personal striving, right? So it's not just a song against the Vietnam War. It's a song from the point of view of a widow, right, whose husband died in the Vietnam War. So the political becomes personal, and the personal expression, or rather the expression of one's personal feelings, becomes political. There's a kind of circularity there. Here's the cover for the album Loretta, which features the song Rated X. Dolly Parton, another major force of country music in the 1970s. If you remember, we talked about her on the Porter Wagoner show and saw that she was having some trouble getting a solo career, that all of her hits in the 60s were mostly duets with Porter Wagoner. But then in the 70s, she saw a burst of writing creativity. She became a great country music songwriter, and then she achieved stardom as a solo act. Her first number one hit was Jolene in February of 74, about basically a woman asking another woman not to encourage her man to be unfaithful, right? That she knows she can't compete with Jolene, but please don't take my man, right? There are all sorts of ways to read that song, of course, but that was one of her big hits. And that year she left the Wagoner show, and then she wrote her next hit in honor of him, right? I Will Always Love You, which, as you probably know, becomes a huge hit for Whitney Houston. It was also a hit for her. It was the number one hit in June of 1974 for Dolly Parton. It's not a stereotypically country song by any means. When you listen to it, it's very much a pop crossover kind of song, and she wrote that not for a romantic love, but for Porter Wagoner, for the attachment she felt toward him. Then Emmylou Harris, especially with the album Pieces of Sky in 1975. Emmylou Harris first came to national attention with her work with Graham Parsons, basically the creator of country rock that we've already talked about, on his solo material, especially the 1973 album Grievous Angel, which was released after Parsons' death from an overdose. That's an amazing album, and she plays a pretty big role in it. She signed to Reprise Records and released Pieces of Sky in 1975, which was a very expensive country album. It featured a hot band composed of rockabilly artists, and it has a very distinctive style. Her next release, Lead Hotel in 75, so the same year, became a number one album on the country charts and confirmed her reputation. By 1977, she's moving toward ever more traditional country, and she releases a series of roots records, so songs that are more in the bluegrass vein or the old folk tradition vein, and those are still very celebrated. I think these first two albums are really amazing, but they're not her typical style, at least not what most people think of as her typical style. She's much more in the roots-based form of country after that. There were other important country artists of the 1970s, of course, too many to mention probably, but let's mention at least a few. There's John Denver, of course, Take Me Home, Country Roads, 1971, huge hit for him. He was also something of a controversial figure. I mean, some people felt that he was quote-unquote fake country, that he was too pop-oriented to be real country, so much to the point that Charlie Rich, for instance, burned the card with his name on it, announcing one of his awards that he won, a Grammy or whatever, he pulled out a lighter and burned the name of the card, right? So there was this sense that John Denver wasn't real country. Then you had Glenn Campbell, who got his start as part of the Wrecking Crew. He was part of the instrumental, the studio musicians working with Phil Spector and so on. He had a huge hit with Wichita Lineman in 68, and then he had a series of other hits later. Charlie Pride, of course, and Charlie Daniels. Charlie Pride, who just recently died, one of the few black presences in country music, especially of this time where country music had become ever more traditional and therefore ever more homogenized. Very important important presence in country music. And Charlie Daniels, The Devil Went Down to Georgia, sort of more raucous, kind of not quite outlaw country, but not totally divorced from that either. And then one of my favorites, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, which is this kind of wonderful amalgamation of a kind of interest in some of the southern rock music, although certainly not that sound, not that kind of raucousness. Still mostly acoustic, the stuff that they did. Very traditionally minded in some ways, drawing on bluegrass influences. On this album, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, they do that song, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, from the Carter family, with Maybelle Carter participating in it, right? So there's this real sense of the tradition, but there's also a sense of building on that tradition and doing more expansive rock-related kinds of music. Just an amazing band from that era. That's it for this session. I'll see you the next.